The lawyer in the gray suit read the line one more time, slower, as though giving them all a chance to absorb it. To my niece, Marjorie Holloway, I leave the sum of $3 and the property at Threadneedle Point as it stands. Brendan laughed first. It came out of him in a single dry bark, the kind of laugh men release when they have been holding still too long in a room they think is wasting their time. Curtis caught it half a second later, softer, more polite, but the same shape. He glanced at his brother and shook his head, and the corner of his mouth turned up the way it used to turn up when the two of them were boys and had just gotten away with something. Marjorie Holloway, 76 years old, sitting between her sons in a wooden chair that made her bad hip ache, did not laugh. She looked at the lawyer instead. White-haired, weathered, early 70s, the kind of face you saw on men who had spent a lot of years outdoors. He did not look at her sons. He looked only at her. And what she saw in his face, in the long, steady second before he turned the page, was not pity, and it was not amusement. It was something closer to recognition. What none of them knew yet, not the sons in their good suits, not even Marjorie herself, was that the condemned lighthouse her great-aunt had left her on a 4-mile stretch of granite and spruce on the Maine coast was not condemned at all. It had been waiting. For 62 years, it had been waiting for the right person to come back with the right key. If this story is already pulling at something in you, hit the like button and subscribe to Left Behind, and drop a comment below telling me where in the world you're watching from. She had almost nothing left. No one knew what was waiting. Keep watching. $3, Brendan said, because Brendan had always been the one who could not let a silence sit. $3. Brendan, Marjorie said quietly. No, Mom, I'm sorry, but $3 in a condemned lighthouse. He turned to Curtis. Did Aunt Iola hate her? She didn't hate her, Curtis said. He was the gentler of the two, which had always meant that his cruelty took more careful shapes. She just, you know how she got at the end? She was 94. She probably thought it was funny. It is funny, Brendan said. Boys. That was the lawyer. His voice was lower than it had been a moment before. I'd thank you to let your mother sit with this. Brendan's eyebrows went up. He was 52 and a senior accountant at a firm in Boston, and he was not used to being corrected by men he considered beneath him. But he did not say anything. There was something in the lawyer's voice that did not invite a second exchange. Marjorie folded her hands in her lap. She looked down at the page in front of her, a photocopy of the will, the line about the $3 and the lighthouse circled in light pencil, and she felt a small, clean stillness move through her chest. The kind of stillness she had felt twice before in her life. Once when her husband Frank had told her, in the kitchen of their house in Worcester, that he had been sick for a year and had not wanted to worry her. And once when a doctor had said the word benign about a shadow on a scan after a month of waiting, and she had nodded as if she had known all along. She had not known either time. She had only learned, over a long life, how to be still while the news arranged itself into its true shape. Mr. Penhallow, she said. Mrs. Holloway. Did my aunt leave any other instructions? Hollis Penhallow folded his hands on the desk. They were broad hands, knuckled, the right index finger crooked at the joint where it had once been broken and not set straight. She did, ma'am. She asked that I drive you up to Threadneedle Point myself, at my own expense, at a time of your choosing. She was very particular about that part. Brendan made a small sound through his nose. For $3, he said. The lawyer did not answer him. He looked at Marjorie and waited. Marjorie looked back at the page. $3. The property at Threadneedle Point as it stands. All right, she said. After the will was read, the four of them stood in the small reception area of the funeral home. The funeral itself had been the day before. Aunt Iola Pemberton had been buried in the plot in Hadley's Cove that her parents had occupied since the 40s, and Marjorie had not been able to fly up for it because Brendan had said it would be a hardship on the family, and Curtis had said it would be hard on her hip, and the funeral home in Worcester had agreed to host a memorial reading of the will the following Saturday as a courtesy. Marjorie had not pushed back. She had not pushed back on a great many things in the last 6 years. Frank had been gone since 2020, and grief had taught her something she had not expected to learn. that her sons had been waiting longer than she realized. For the moment, she became smaller than she had been. It had not happened all at once. It rarely does. It had happened in the small ways. A check Brendan had written for her property taxes one year, with a polite note saying he'd handle it from now on, and the polite phone call afterward suggesting she let him manage the household account, just to make things easier. The new car Curtis had picked out for her, smaller than her old one, because the old one was too much for her to handle, he said, even though she had been driving the same Buick for 17 years without an incident. The conversation at Easter 2 years ago, when both sons had agreed in front of her, as if she were already not in the room, that Mom was probably going to need to start thinking about her living situation soon. She had not needed to start thinking about her living situation. She had been managing fine. But the conversation had happened, and the next one had happened, and the one after that, and somewhere in the middle of them, she had stopped being a woman who lived in a house and become a problem her sons were arranging. Aunt Iola had not been part of those conversations. Aunt Iola had been her mother's older sister, and she had moved to Maine in 1962, and she had run the old Threadneedle Point light from 1965 until the federal automation order in 1986, and she had stayed on as caretaker after the Lighthouse was decommissioned, and she had refused to leave even when the Coast Guard offered to relocate her. She had been a tall, narrow, weather-cut woman with iron gray hair she wore in a single braid down her back. Marjorie had visited her 3 times as a girl and twice as a young married woman. Frank had not liked the drive. After Frank, she had not made the drive alone. She had called Iola on the first Sunday of every month for 38 years instead, and Iola had called her back when she missed a Sunday, and the calls had been short and dry and full of weather reports and small dry jokes, and they had been one of the truest things in Marjorie's life. Iola had died on a Tuesday in October at 94. Hollis Penhallow had called from Maine that same afternoon. The funeral was 3 days later. Brendan and Curtis had both been very sorry. Curtis had sent flowers. Now, they stood in the reception area of the funeral home, and Brendan was checking his watch. "Mom," he said, "we need to talk." "All right. You're not seriously thinking about going up there. Mr. Penhallow has offered to drive me." "Mr. Penhallow," Brendan said, "is a stranger." "Mr. Penhallow," Marjorie said, "is the lawyer your aunt trusted for the last 40 years of her life." Curtis stepped in. He had always stepped in for Brendan. It was the choreography of their boyhood, refined into adulthood, and Marjorie had watched it for half a century. "Mom," Curtis said gently, "we're just thinking about you. It's a long drive. You've never driven up there alone. The property is... We looked it up on the way over here. It's on the historical register. You can't sell it. You can't develop it. You can't even live in it. The Lighthouse hasn't been certified for occupancy since 1986. $3, Brendan said again, more quietly this time, almost to himself. "What I'm saying," Curtis went on, "is that this isn't really an inheritance, Mom. Aunt Iola was a private person. She was eccentric. We loved her. But this is a piece of paper about a building you can't use, and the trip up there is going to wear you out, and there's nothing waiting for you at the end of it." Marjorie did not answer right away. She looked across the small room at Hollis Penhallow, who was standing by the coat rack with his hat in his hands, waiting. He had not interrupted. He had not tried to. But when she met his eye, he gave her one small nod. It was not the nod of a man saying you should go. It was the nod of a man saying, "I will be there if you do." Marjorie had spent 6 years being managed. She had spent 6 years being told what was good for her by men who did not know how to ask. She thought of Iola, tall, narrow, weather-cut, and she thought of the small, dry voice on the other end of the phone every first Sunday, asking after her hip and reading her the tide chart and never once telling her what was good for her. "Curtis," she said, "I appreciate that you're worried. I'm not worried. I appreciate it." She turned to Brendan. "I'm going." Brendan's mouth opened. He closed it. He looked at his brother. His brother shrugged in the small, precise way he shrugged when he had decided a fight was not worth winning today. "All right, Mom," Brendan said, "if that's what you want." "It is. Just call us when you get there." "I will." She did not say what she was thinking, which was that she had not been called when they got anywhere in the last 6 years, but she had always called them. She walked across the room to Hollis Penhallow. "Mr. Penhallow," she said, "when can you drive me?" Tomorrow morning, ma'am. If you're ready. I'm ready. The drive from Worcester to Hadley's Cove was a little more than 5 hours by way of the inland route through New Hampshire and across the lower stretch of Maine, and Hollis Penhallow drove it without filling the silence. Marjorie liked him for it. They stopped once at a rest area outside Portsmouth so she could stretch her hip. He bought her a cup of coffee from a vending machine and did not apologize for the quality of it. They talked a little in the careful, unhurried way of people who have already decided they would tell each other the truth. He told her he had known her aunt for 41 years. He had been her aunt's only lawyer for 37 of them. He had drawn up 6 different wills for her in that time. The last one had been finalized in February of this year, 8 months before her death. She had been very particular about it. What was she like? Marjorie asked. He thought about that for a moment. Stubborn, he said. Funny. She had the sharpest tongue of any woman I've ever known. And she was patient. He glanced at her. She was the most patient person I've ever known. Patient about what? About waiting for the right time to give a thing to the right person. Marjorie did not answer. They got back on the road. The land flattened toward the coast and then began to rise again. Granite outcrops pushing up through the spruce, and the air through her open window started to carry the cold mineral smell she remembered from her summers in Maine as a girl. She had not smelled that air in over 40 years. It went through her chest like a small, clean knife. Hollis, she said. Yes, ma'am. My sons think she was joking. Your sons, he said, have not yet been to Threadneedle Point. They reached Hadley's Cove a little after 1 in the afternoon. The town was a thin scatter of clapboard houses and a single hardware store and a gas station and a small white church with a steeple that listed an inch to the east, and then the road bent around a granite shoulder and the trees broke open and Marjorie saw the water. The Atlantic in late October was the color of old slate, and the wind came across it carrying the faint iron smell of seaweed and the deeper cold smell of distance. And Threadneedle Point was a fist of dark rock pushed out into the water at the end of a narrow road that turned to gravel at the last quarter mile. Hollis slowed the car. That's the property line, he said, where the gravel starts. Marjorie looked. The property went on and on. The gravel road ran a full mile through spruce woods that thinned as they climbed, and then came out onto a broad headland of wind-bent grass and exposed granite, and at the far end of the headland, where the rock dropped 60 feet straight into the surf, stood the lighthouse. It was a stone tower painted white once, a long time ago. The paint had gone gray and chalky on the seaward side. The lantern room at the top still had its glass, dulled with salt, and the iron walkway around the lantern was rust-colored against the gray sky. A small attached keeper's cottage huddled against the base of the tower like a child against a parent's leg, its slate roof streaked black with lichen. Hollis stopped the car at the edge of the gravel apron in front of the cottage. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The wind came off the water, even impatient, and pushed the long grass flat. The only sound besides the wind was the slow, distant boom of the swell hitting the foot of the granite 100 feet below them. Aunt Iola lived here, Marjorie said, for 62 years. By herself. By herself. Marjorie opened the passenger door. The cold hit her at chest height. It smelled the way the air had smelled at the rest stop outside Portsmouth, but stronger and older, and underneath the seaweed and the granite, there was something else, something that smelled like a house that had been closed for a long time and was waiting to be opened. She stood in the gravel apron with her hand on the open car door, and she looked up at the lighthouse, and she thought very clearly that she had been brought here for a reason. Hollis came around the front of the car. There's a key in the cottage door, he said. Iola left it there. She said you'd know which door to start with. Marjorie did not know, but she walked up to the cottage anyway, her bad hip catching on the step, and she put her hand on the worn brass knob. It turned without the key. The door was unlocked. She looked back at Hollis. He had stopped at the edge of the apron, 10 feet behind her, and he was watching with the expression of a man who already knew what she was going to find on the other side of the door and had decided not to walk her through it. You go in first, he said quietly. It's yours, Mrs. Holloway, not mine. Marjorie turned back to the door. She drew a breath. She pushed. The door opened on a narrow flagstone hall. The air that came out of the cottage was cold, but not stale, clean, faintly wood smoke, the way the air smells in a house that has been kept but not occupied for a season. She stepped inside. To her left was a small parlor with 2 armchairs and a banked fireplace, and a wool blanket folded over one of the chairs. To her right was a kitchen with a porcelain sink and a wood stove and a kettle on the stove and a tin of loose tea on the counter beside the kettle. Straight ahead, on a small oak table in the hall, sitting in the exact center of the table where it could not have been missed, was a single black and white photograph in a plain wooden frame. Marjorie walked over to it. She picked it up. It was a photograph of her. She was perhaps 4 years old, maybe 5, standing on the granite headland in front of this same lighthouse. Her mother was holding her hand. Her Aunt Iola was kneeling beside her. Both women were smiling. Marjorie was looking up at her aunt with the particular open delight a small child reserves for someone she has only just learned how to love. Marjorie did not remember the photograph being taken. Marjorie did not remember ever standing on this headland as a child. She turned the frame over. On the back, in her aunt's narrow, careful hand, was a single line written in pencil. For when you finally come home, Marjorie, everything you need is here. She set the frame down on the table. Her hand was shaking. Behind her, in the doorway, Hollis Penhallow said quietly, "She's been waiting for you a long time, ma'am." Marjorie did not move for a long moment. She stood with her hand resting on the edge of the oak table. The photograph turned face up again, and she let her eyes travel slowly around the small flagstone hall. The cottage was warmer than it should have been. Not warm, never warm in October on a granite point in Maine, but the cold inside the walls was a held cold, the cold of a place someone had banked a fire in 2 days ago and then walked away from with an even hand. "Alice," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "When was she last in this house?" 3 weeks before she passed. She came down off the point for the last time on a Friday. She had me drive her into town. She knew. She'd been telling me she knew for about a year by then. And the fire in the parlor? "I came up Tuesday morning and laid one. I figured you might come this week. I figured if you did, you ought to walk into a house that knew you were coming." Marjorie turned to look at him. He was still standing in the doorway, hat in his hands, and the wind off the headland was lifting the gray hair at his temple and laying it back down again. And he was watching her with the patience of a man who had been told what to do and had decided to do it well. "Thank you," she said. "Yes, ma'am." She walked into the kitchen first, because the kitchen was where she had always gone first in her own house, and because the kitchen of someone you have loved is the room that tells you the most about what their life had actually been like at the end. The wood stove was clean. The kettle had been emptied. The tin of tea was Twining's English breakfast. Iola's tea, the one she had drunk on every phone call for 38 years, the small, thin clatter of the spoon against the cup faintly audible through the receiver every first Sunday of the month. There was a wool sweater hanging on a peg by the back door. Marjorie touched the sleeve of it without thinking. It still smelled faintly of wood smoke and of the lavender sachet Iola had always kept in her drawers. She did not cry. She had cried for Iola 3 times already in the last 3 weeks. Once when Hollis had called, once at her own kitchen table the next morning, and once standing in the bathroom of the funeral home before the will reading. The crying had been honest each time, and it was finished. What she felt now, standing in the kitchen of the woman who had waited 62 years for her to come home, was something closer to gratitude. The kind of gratitude that has no surface to it. The kind that is simply the shape of a room. "There's a door," Hollis said. She turned. He had stepped into the hall and was pointing, not in any urgent way, just lifting one knuckled finger toward the wall opposite the kitchen. She had not noticed it on the way in. It was a narrow door, set flush into the wood paneling of the hall, painted the same cream color as the wall around it, with a small black iron latch and no handle. If you were not looking for it, you would walk past it and never see it. The door went down. She could tell from the angle of the latch and the slight settle of the frame that whatever was on the other side of that door was not on the same floor as the rest of the cottage. "Cellar?" she said. "Not exactly. Iola called it the workroom. She said you'd know what to do when you got to it. I don't know what to do when I get to it." "No, ma'am. I don't expect you do yet. But she said you would." Marjorie walked to the door. The latch lifted easily. The door swung inward on a low groan, and a colder current of air came up around her ankles, smelling of stone and old paper and something faintly metallic. The smell of a place that had been kept dry for a long time on purpose. A flight of narrow wooden stairs went down into the dark. There was a brass switch on the wall just inside the door. Marjorie flicked it. A bare bulb came on at the bottom of the stairs, and then a second bulb halfway across whatever room lay beneath the cottage, and a low, clean light showed her what was waiting. She drew a slow breath. "Hollis," she said, without turning around. "Yes, ma'am. Did you know about this?" "I knew it existed. I never came down. Iola asked me not to." Marjorie put her hand on the doorframe and started down the stairs. Her hip caught on the third step, and she paused, and Hollis came up behind her without a word and offered his elbow, and she took it without pride, and they went the rest of the way down together. The room at the bottom was a long stone-walled space, the full footprint of the cottage above it. The floor was flagstone, swept clean. Along the left-hand wall ran a workbench with a row of small wooden drawers above it, and a green-shaded lamp clipped to the front edge. Along the right-hand wall were 3 tall oak filing cabinets, and beside them a glass-fronted bookcase, and beside the bookcase a heavy iron-banded chest the size of a steamer trunk, set against the stone with its lid closed. In the center of the room, on a square table covered by a folded canvas drop-cloth, sat something tall and rectangular and roughly the size of a kitchen chair, its shape disguised by the cloth. "What is all this?" Marjorie said quietly. "Her work," Hollis said, "such as it was. Iola was she called herself a salvage cartographer. I didn't know what that meant for the first 10 years I knew her. I don't know that I fully know now." "A what?" "She mapped wrecks." He paused. "Not for the federal registers. For private clients. She had a specialty. There's a stretch of coast from Mount Desert down to Monhegan where the bottom shelves out in a particular way, and ships have been going down there since the 1700s, and a great deal of what went down with them was never recovered, because the official charts of that bottom were drawn wrong on purpose by people who wanted the wrecks left alone. Iola redrew them, privately, for people she trusted." Marjorie stared at him. "My Aunt Iola," she said, "the woman who ran a lighthouse in Maine for 50-something years and read me the tide chart on the phone every Sunday, was a private cartographer for marine salvage." "Yes, ma'am." "For how long?" "Since 1969. "And what did she—" "How does that—" "It paid very well, Mrs. Holloway. For a long time." Marjorie set her hand on the back of the chair beside the workbench. She lowered herself into it. The chair was solid oak, worn smooth on the arms by 60 years of one woman's hands. She looked across the room at the canvas-draped shape on the center table. "Is that what I think it is?" "I don't know what you think it is, ma'am. I think it's a chart." "It's a chart." She did not get up right away. She sat for a moment with her hands folded in her lap and let the room arrange itself around her. The filing cabinets, the bookcase, the iron-banded chest. A whole working life she had not known her aunt had been living, conducted 4 miles outside a Maine town of 900 people, in a stone room under a cottage at the foot of a lighthouse, by a woman who had never once mentioned it on the phone. "Hollis," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "Why didn't she tell me?" Hollis was quiet for a long moment. He had moved over to the workbench and was looking at the row of small wooden drawers, not touching them, just looking. "She told me once," he said, "that the people who get to know about a thing like this are the people who find it for themselves. She said that was the rule of her work. She said the same rule applied to her family." That's a hard rule." "Yes, ma'am, it is. But she said you of all people would understand it once you got here." Marjorie did not answer that, because she did not yet understand it, and because she had a feeling that understanding it was going to take more than the next 10 minutes. She got up. She crossed to the center table and lifted the corner of the canvas drop cloth and folded it back. Underneath was a chart, mounted on a hinged easel, drawn in black ink on heavy cream paper. The chart showed a stretch of coast she recognized, Threadneedle Point at the upper edge, the long granite shoulder of the headland, the curve of the bay south of it. But the bay on this chart was not blank water the way it was on the standard NOAA charts she had seen as a girl. The bay was full of small, careful notations in her aunt's narrow hand. Crosses, numbers, dates, little ink sketches of hulls, schooners, a brig, what looked like a small steam tug. bearings written out in degrees. Depths. The names of vessels written beside the crosses, and beside the names, in a separate column, dollar amounts. Marjorie's eye caught on one of the dollar amounts. She read it twice to be sure. She turned to Hollis, who had come up beside her. Is this a working document? It's the master, ma'am. There are working copies in the file cabinets. The clients only ever saw the working copies. The master never left this room. And these numbers, estimated recoverable value, adjusted to last year. Iola updated them every January. Marjorie looked back at the chart. She found the cross nearest to Threadneedle Point. The notation beside it read Eliza Caro, 1847, ironbound chest, unrecovered. The dollar amount in the right-hand column was a number Marjorie had to read 3 times before her mind would accept it as a real figure attached to a real object on a real piece of paper. She felt her hand settle very gently on the edge of the easel, the way a person who has been told to sit down sometimes settles a hand on the back of a chair before doing it. "Alice," she said. "Yes, ma'am. How much of this is mine?" "All of it, Mrs. Holloway. That was the entire point of the will. And your sons inherited what your aunt felt your sons had earned the right to inherit, which was $3. She let that settle. She looked across the chart at the small, careful sketch of a brig that her aunt had drawn near the southern edge of the bay, and she thought about Brendan in his suit at the funeral home reception, laughing, the dry single bark of a laugh, the kind men release when they have been holding still too long in a room they think is wasting their time. And she felt something move in her chest that was not anger exactly, but was related to anger the way a tide is related to the moon. If this story has found its way to you, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story from Left Behind. Your support is what keeps these stories coming, and there are so many more waiting to be told. She straightened. "Hollis." "Yes, ma'am. I'd like to see what's in the chest." He nodded. He walked over to the iron-banded chest by the wall, knelt with some difficulty. His knees were no better than her hip, and he lifted the lid. The chest was not locked. Inside, in neat oilcloth-wrapped bundles, were ledgers. 6 of them, bound in dark green canvas, the way Iola's sister had bound her own diaries in the 40s. Marjorie knelt down beside Hollis. She lifted out the topmost ledger and laid it on her lap, and opened it. The first page was dated April 1969. The handwriting was Iola's. The first entry read, "Began the work today. Frank and Ruth's girl is 5 years old. I am keeping this for her. She will not need it for a very long time, I hope, but she will need it eventually. They are not the kind of people who will leave her with anything when she is old." Marjorie read the line twice. Then she read it a third time, and the third time she read it her hand began to shake against the canvas binding, and she set the ledger down carefully on the flagstone floor, and she pressed both hands flat against her thighs the way a person does when she is trying to hold a very large thing still inside herself. "Frank and Ruth," she said, "your father and your mother. She started this for me when I was 5 years old." "Yes, ma'am." She was 41 years old. She had just moved up here. She barely knew me. I'd been to visit her twice. She made up her mind, ma'am. That was the kind of woman she was. Marjorie picked the ledger up again. She turned the pages. The entries were short, sometimes only a line, sometimes a paragraph. The dates moved forward through the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. There were entries on the days Marjorie's parents had died. There were entries on the day Marjorie had married Frank. There was an entry the week each of her sons had been born, Brendan in 1973, Curtis in 1976, and the entries about Brendan and Curtis grew, over the years, into something that was not quite warm. The older boy is selfish in a way I recognize. He gets it from a Holloway side. The younger one is gentler, but follows the older one's lead, which is the more dangerous of the two failings. Marjorie does not see it yet. She will. The entry was dated November 1989. The boys had been 16 and 13. Marjorie sat for a long moment with the ledger open on her lap. Upstairs in the cottage, the wind off the headland pushed at one of the window panes and made the old glass rattle softly in its frame. "She knew," Marjorie said. "She'd been watching, ma'am, for a long way off, with a telephone and a pen. She knew before I did." "Yes, ma'am, I think she did." Marjorie closed the ledger. She set it back on top of the others in the chest, gently, and she rested her hand on the canvas binding for a moment, and then she stood up, Hollis offering his elbow again without comment, and she walked back across the room to the workbench and stood looking at the chart on the easel. In her coat pocket, her phone began to vibrate. She took it out. The screen said Brendan. She looked at it for 2 full rings. Then she put it back in her pocket without answering. Hollis. Yes, ma'am. How long would it take you to draw up papers? What kind of papers? Whatever papers, I need to make sure that what's in this room cannot be taken from me by anyone, including by my sons, including if something happens to me. Hollis Penhallow looked at her for a long moment. What moved behind his eyes was not surprise. It was something closer to recognition, the same recognition she had seen in his face at the funeral home when he had read the line about $3 and not looked at her sons. I can have the first set of papers drafted by tomorrow evening, ma'am, he said. I can have them filed in Augusta by the end of the week. Then please do. Yes, ma'am. Her phone buzzed again in her pocket. She did not take it out this time. She turned back to the chart on the easel and laid her hand flat on the cream paper, on the long granite arm of threadneedle point her aunt had drawn in 1969, and she stood there for a long time, in a stone room beneath a cottage beneath a lighthouse on a cold October afternoon in Maine, while 400 miles south of her in a brick colonial in a Boston suburb. Her older son sat at his kitchen table with his phone in his hand, and the call went to voicemail for the 3rd time, and felt for the first time in 20 years, the small, precise feeling of a door closing on the other side of a room he had thought he owned. Brendan called 4 more times that evening. Marjorie did not pick up. She and Hollis had driven back into Hadley's Cove a little after dark, and Hollis had checked her into the small inn at the top of the main street, a 4-room place above the hardware store, run by a widow named Edith Marchand who had known Iola for 30 years and who, when Hollis introduced Marjorie at the desk, had come around the counter without a word and held Marjorie's hand in both of her own for a long, quiet moment before saying, Your aunt told me you'd come. I have the front room ready. The front room was small and clean, and it had a single window that looked out across the harbor, and on the dresser, when Marjorie walked in, was a vase of late asters and a folded note in Edith's hand that read, Welcome home, dear. Marjorie sat down on the edge of the bed. She held the note for a long time. Then she took out her phone and looked at the call log. Brendan 4 times, Curtis twice, a text for Brendan that read, Mom, please call me back. This is getting ridiculous. And she set the phone face down on a nightstand and turned off the lamp. She slept better that night than she had slept in 6 years. Underscore. Underscore for the next morning, she met Hollis at the diner across from the inn at 7, and they drove back out to Threadneedle Point in his car, and she spent the whole of that day in the cottage and the stone room beneath it. She did not rush. She read the ledgers in order, all 6 of them. It took her until early afternoon, with a break at noon for the sandwich Edith had wrapped in wax paper and pressed in her hand on the way out the door, and by the time she closed the last ledger and set it back in the chest, she understood 3 things she had not understood when she had walked into the cottage the day before. The first was that her aunt had been working for 40 years, with the patient, sustained intelligence of a woman who had nothing else competing for her attention, on a single coherent project. The project was Marjorie. Specifically, it was the construction of a financial and legal architecture that would reach Marjorie in old age and reach her cleanly, and reach her past the people Iola had identified as far back as 1989 as the most likely obstacles. The second was that the chart on the easel was not the most valuable thing in the room. The most valuable thing in the room was the 3rd filing cabinet against the east wall, the one labeled Clients Current, which Marjorie opened on the afternoon of the 2nd day, and which contained signed retainer agreements with 23 private salvage operations up and down the eastern seaboard, every one of which had been paying Iola Pemberton between $4,000 and $11,000 a quarter for cartographic consulting since the late 90s. The retainers had not stopped at Iola's death. They were structured to continue, with the work redirected to whoever inherited the master chart. The third was that the lighthouse itself was not condemned. It had been certified as decommissioned in 1986, which was a different thing entirely, and what the federal certification had actually done was release the structure from Coast Guard maintenance obligations and transfer full private ownership to the keeper of record. Iola had been the keeper of record. Iola had quietly, over the course of 37 years, restored the tower from the inside out, working in winter when no one came down the road, paying cash to a single contractor in Bangor who is dead now and whose receipts were filed in the second cabinet. The lantern room at the top of the tower was glassed and weathertight. The keeper's quarters one floor below it had been converted, in 2003, into a small study with a coal stove and a writing desk and a narrow brass bed. The lighthouse was a house. It had been a house for 23 years. Marjorie climbed the iron spiral stair on the afternoon of the third day, with Hollis behind her in case her hip went, and she came up through the trapdoor into the converted keeper's quarters and stood for a long time at the seaward window, looking out at the gray Atlantic, and she thought about the last phone call she had ever had with her aunt, 3 weeks before Iola died, on the first Sunday of October, and the small, dry voice on the other end of the line saying, just before they said, "Goodbye, Marjorie dear. I want you to know I've kept the place up. The whole place. I want you to know that." She had thought at the time her aunt was rambling. She understood now her aunt had been telling her, plainly and exactly, what was waiting. "But I'm not going to be smaller than I am for you any longer. I am too old to be smaller than I am. And I do not have enough years left to spend any more of them apologizing for taking up the room I take up." The fire in the grate popped softly. Outside, the wind off the headland moved through the spruce on the seaward side of the cottage, even and patient, the way it had moved through them for 62 years while a tall, narrow, weather-cut woman sat at a writing desk one floor, below a lantern room, and built, in the slow, careful hand of a person who had nothing else competing for her attention, the architecture that would carry her sister's daughter home. After a long moment, Brendan stood up. He did not say anything. He walked to the door. Curtis followed, half a step behind him, the way Curtis had always followed Brendan, and at the door Curtis turned and looked back at her. "Mom," he said. "Yes, Curtis. Would it be all right if I called you? Next week, just to talk?" She looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," she said. "You may call me next week." "But Curtis." "Yes, Mom. You will not call me to discuss the property. You will not call me to discuss my living situation. You will not call me to discuss a trust, or a will, or a power of attorney, or anything related to any of those things. If you do, I will hang up the phone, and the next call will be a month later. Do you understand?" "Yes, Mom." "Then yes. You may call me." He nodded. Brendan was already in the car. Curtis went out and closed the door behind him, and Marjorie sat in the parlor in the chair her aunt had sat in, with her hands folded in her lap, and listened to the German sedan pull around in the apron and crunch slowly back down the gravel road toward the highway. She listened until she could not hear it anymore. Then she listened to the wind for a while longer, and to the slow, distant boom of the swell hitting the foot of the granite 100 feet below the cottage. And after a time, Hollis came in from the kitchen with a fresh pot of tea and sat down across from her without speaking, the way a man sits down across from someone who has just done a hard thing well. "Hollis." "Yes, ma'am." "Pour the tea." He poured the tea. Underscore. Underscore Marjorie did not move into the lighthouse that winter. Her hip was not up to the spiral stair every day, and the cottage was warmer, and the cottage was where Iola had lived. She moved into the cottage in the second week of November, with 2 suitcases from the inn and a box of books Edith Marchand had pressed on her, and she lived there through the long Maine winter with the wood stove going and a stack of her aunt's ledgers on the parlor table. And she read them in order, slowly, the way you read the diary of someone you have just begun to understand you loved. The work continued. She learned the work. She was 76 years old, and she learned the work because Iola had built it to be learnable by exactly the kind of woman Marjorie had become: patient, careful, quietly stubborn, capable of paying attention to a thing for a long time without needing the thing to pay attention back. Hollis introduced her to 2 of the clients in the first month, and the clients introduced her to 4 more by spring, and by the following October, 1 full year after Iola's death, Marjorie Holloway was operating the salvage cartography practice her aunt had run out of the stone room beneath the cottage for 56 years. She was not as good at it as Iola had been. She was good enough. The library benefit she funded in Hadley's Cove the following summer, a children's reading room named for Iola Pemberton, with a small brass plaque by the door that read "Patience is a form of love," was attended by every person in town and by Curtis, who had, by then, called every Tuesday for 9 months and had not once mentioned the property. Brendan did not come. Brendan had not called. Marjorie accepted both facts the way you accept weather. On the night of the benefit, after the last guest had gone home and Edith had locked the library door, Marjorie walked down to the harbor by herself. The water was black and calm and smelled of seaweed and granite and the deeper, cold smell of distance. She stood at the end of the public dock in the dark with her hands in the pockets of her coat, and she looked east across the water toward the long granite arm of Threadneedle Point and the small, steady pulse of the light at the end of it, a light she had relit herself on a clear evening in May, for the first time since 1986, with a permit from the Coast Guard and the help of a young electrician from Bangor, whose grandfather had been the man Iola had paid in cash for 37 years. The light went around. It went around again. Marjorie stood on the dock and watched it for a long time. She thought about her aunt at 41, in 1969, sitting down at a writing desk in a stone room beneath a cottage beneath a lighthouse, and opening a green canvas-bound ledger and writing the first line. Began the work today. Frank and Ruth's girl is 5 years old. I am keeping this for her. She thought about her sons in the parlor on the morning Brendan's car had pulled into the apron. She thought about Frank, gone 6 years, who had loved her and who had not known about any of this, and who would have, she believed, been quietly and entirely glad. The light went around. Marjorie turned and walked back up the dock toward the inn, and her hip caught a little on the loose plank halfway up, and she did not mind it, because the hip was hers and the walk was hers, and the cottage at the end of the gravel road was hers, and the stone room beneath the cottage was hers, and the lighthouse at the end of the headland was hers, and the work. The long, patient work her aunt had begun in 1969 and carried for 56 years and handed across in the form of a $3 inheritance and a circled line on a will was hers. What was left behind was never truly gone. The right hands had found it. Thank you for sitting with this story all the way to the end. The people who stay for the whole story are the ones who understand it. If it moved you, the videos on your screen right now are waiting to do the same. And if you haven't subscribed yet, come home. Left Behind has a story for you.